Welcome to episode 46 of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast, a bi-weekly look at cybersecurity, including interviews, news, expert tips, and the latest trends. I'm Kevin Baxter, and I'm joined by my Firewalls.com colleague, Andrew Harmon.
Hello there.
Hey, Andrew. As we tackle a different featured topic each episode. New ones are normally out every other Wednesday, so subscribe or follow on your favorite platform to get the latest first. Please do rate and review us, and drop us a line anytime at podcast@firewalls.com. As always, thanks for listening, and this episode will be a little different than most, as we have not one, but two excellent interviews to share.
Right, and we first take a broader look at how people frame cyber attacks, why that framing can cause problems, and how to start fixing those problems. We have Emma Schroeder and Trey Herr of the Atlantic Council's Cyber Statecraft Initiative. And then right after that, we'll be welcoming technology writer and former IT pro Lance Whitney to discuss some of the latest news in the cyber world, including the status of the DarkSide Group following the Colonial Pipeline attack, a new ransomware warning for healthcare providers, and another cyber attack facing consumers.
So let's get started welcoming Emma and Trey to this episode of Ping. So to talk about a little bit different angle on the various cyber attacks that we've seen recently, including most recently the Colonial Pipeline attack, article titled Cybersecurity as Counterterrorism, Seeking a Better Debate. We welcome two of its authors, Emma Schroeder and Trey Herr. Emma and Trey, thank you very much for joining us on Ping today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks.
Before we get started, how about each of you introduce yourselves and what you do a little bit to our listeners? Emma, do you want to take it first?
Sure. So as Kevin said, my name is Emma Schroeder. I am an assistant director at the Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council. I joined last year after getting my master's degree at King's College, focusing on war studies, military history, and particularly military strategy, with a large focus on asymmetric warfare and cybersecurity. So I'm really excited about this project in particular.
So my name is Trey Herr. I run the Cyber Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council. And Cyber Statecraft is sort of an attempt to take cybersecurity and mix both operational expertise and strategy together in a very messy cocktail that produces hopefully interesting ideas. So I was fortunate enough to join the council coming from Microsoft and some time with Harvard Kennedy School. And I think similar to Emma, this project is something that's been sort of in the back of my brain for a while, is what are more interesting ways to think about cyber conflict that break us out of this continual loop of talking and debating escalation and deterrence and, much more traditional sort of IR concepts and stuff that doesn't always look like what we see in the domain itself.
And of course, timeliness-wise, it seems like more and more, there's plenty to tie it to.
Yes, the upside of working in cybersecurity is there is no shortage of activity and people coming to ask you questions of why is this thing broken, blowing up, or not responding.
As we look in today's topic, maybe blowing up's not the best way to start off. So we kind of start this article in regards to a senior Justice Department official comparing cybersecurity and this rash of attacks as a weapon of mass destruction, which, according to you, may not be the most appropriate or helpful term.
Yeah, absolutely. So this way of thinking has been around for a while, and it is starting to appear less and less, but you do see it still in the kind of politics sphere of things. And I think particularly because it's a strong response to this incident, but the problem is it paints cybersecurity and conflict in cyberspace as catastrophic events to be avoided at all costs. And that's just not the reality of conflict in cyberspace. It is constant contact. We're not all or nothing. We're just trying to do better a little bit by a little bit. As we say in the op-ed, winning is going to be marginal. It's not going to be a big mission accomplished. As well as, as Trey mentioned just before, there's no shortage of incidents for cybersecurity professionals to respond to and talk about. And these incidents are largely at the level below war. And, definitely with that nuclear analogy, we're talking about pretty different spheres here. So we think we need to get away from that way of thinking and get into a way of thinking that says, okay, there is risk. How do we assess it and how do we manage it and deal with that reality of what's in front of us?
I think it's interesting, especially from our perspective. It seems that maybe the cybersecurity world is a bit guilty as well as the political world in this idea of, keeping the hackers out versus in and preparing for the big day when it finally happens. Whereas you're arguing this is much more of a constant but lower stakes sort of battle.
I think that's right. I mean, we've talked about, we've heard that language around the cyber Pearl Harbor going back to, I think it was Leon Panetta that originally articulated it as, the eventual catastrophic day. The challenge is, beyond the fact that it doesn't really represent the day-to-day grind that defenders have to confront, as they're managing network configurations and chasing, weird messages in logs and debugging alerts. These are, not only doesn't match it, it also sort of misrepresents it in our head. And so we start making policy and we start talking about threats with this sense of like, well, if we get it wrong, everything's going to go sideways. We're going to blow up. And I think that part of the reason that we put this together and part of the reason we're working on this topic is, if our policy is intending to prevent catastrophe, it really fails to resource effectively the kind of day-to-day operations and the incredibly unsexy but important risk management and intelligence gathering that we see buy down risk more effectively a lot of the time. So if we're always over here kind of preparing for, D-Day, we may miss the ransomware attack that just keeps owning little bits of our network once a month to the point where it cripples our operations. So I think you're right. It is both a distraction, but also, potentially really undermines our ability to make policy and to drive change on these topics.
Sort of the death by 1,000 cuts possibility there.
Yes, exactly.
So really sort of an overall summation of this idea is basically that cyber attacks are akin to more of a terrorism situation that we deal with now instead of a formalized state versus state war. So how are they similar in that way?
So a few of the things that we talk about in this is, so again, that reality of iterated engagement. So engagement in the cyber domain is frequent, but it's also unpredictable by the sheer fact that there are just so many targets and we're all so interconnected that it's impossible to defend everywhere. You can't predict the one spot that's going to get hit. And leading on from that, you need to have that, risk assessment framework. Additionally, the centrality of the intelligence context. There's a lot of literature about this in both spaces, and this includes both the intelligence needed to scout ahead and also the intelligence needed to conduct your attacks stealthily. And a lot of that information comes from private actors and on-the-ground sources. And finally, the other thing that we talk about is the centrality of private actors. And private actors in this space serve as targets, they serve as attackers, and also as enablers. And they're often indistinguishable from the attackers in some cases. And also these private actors share a lot of the risk and they share, similar fate with the government in terms of cybersecurity. So need to make sure that any strategy we employ takes into account that it's not just, as you said, state versus state. It's kind of everybody on everybody.
Yeah. And I mean, in this recent example of the Colonial Pipeline attack, this is one where obviously Colonial is a private company, but the ripple effects from that certainly affect the government as well.
Yeah, absolutely. We are not, no man is an island, and especially in cyberspace.
Right. So one particular, I guess, I don't want to call it a metaphor, but a sort of example, real world example that you compare this idea to is a string of stabbing attacks that took place in Israel, where the idea in order to defend against that in the future was not so much to just ban all knives in the country and hope for the best, sort of calculus of where is the most risk and what can we do to effectively and practically sort of cut that risk down. So what does that look like in the cyberspace?
I think you're already starting to see it, right? This notion of trying to get past defense of the perimeter and moving into both aggressive collection of information on adversaries, trying to anticipate their behaviors, but also understand their tendencies and techniques, but also sort of in moving in the opposite direction by treating your home turf, as it were, not as a sanctuary, as a protected domain, but similarly as at-risk territory. So not assuming that once you cross the magic line in your home that you're safe. And so I think what you see in cybersecurity is this notion of assumed breach, right, as a really representative example of that, where the discussion is about attempting to implement controls on every transaction, on every access to data, on every piece of equipment on your network, such that were it to be compromised, you had the ability to detect and eliminate or detect and isolate that adversary controlled or influenced device very quickly, and to keep that harm from extending to other parts of the network and to try to minimize the blast, right, damage that the compromise of that device could do to your system as a whole. I think you see that reflected to some extent. We mentioned that in the piece, right, in the defend forward strategy that Cybercom has been promulgating over the last few years, where it's an effort to push the boundary of engagement farther out from the U.S. and from U.S. networks to intermediaries, aggressively gathering intelligence on adversaries to understand where they operate, disrupt those operations where possible. The challenge is, and I think for us, part of the argument is, okay, we're starting to take some of these lessons, but we haven't taken them very far. And when you think about the balance, for example, in where disruption and counterterrorism takes place, right, where there's often these very persistent attempts to disrupt how adversaries operate well prior to an attack, right? Disrupting their financing, disrupting their recruiting, disrupting their sort of home bases or places of operation as a way to keep them off balance and maintain some, gain some protection or maintain some freedom of what's referred as freedom of maneuver for the defender. That's a much more intentional effort. And I think when we're talking about in cybersecurity, again, when you come back to a policymaker and say, hey, I want you to resource me, a network defender, me, DHS, me with Cybercom to operate well outside of my networks on targets that haven't attacked me before, right? Haven't targeted me before, may have only targeted something that kind of looks like me. Then it starts to be a harder pitch to make in somewhere that we're trying to push that language and that framing more aggressively to say, no, it's exactly where you want to be, right? You want the threat to be somewhere far away from you. You want to try to maintain not only your ability to operate against them, but also disrupt their ability to operate against you, as opposed to, hey, harden everything down and hope for, hope that we survive the day the big one comes.
How does this sort of offensive approach that you're advocating for run into some potential barriers with the real world, nation versus nation? Obviously, we know a lot of hacking organizations have ties to Russia, for instance, or ties to maybe North Korea. How does that sort of run into trouble potentially geopolitically if you're trying to sort of take an offensive approach to some of these cyber groups?
Well, so I would push back slightly, right? I don't think it's an offensive approach over defense, and it's rethinking where the balance of offense and defense sits. And it's trying to make sure that defenders are operating with information that's gathered from right where adversaries live, right? And are able to interdict those attacks. But to your point, there's actually a ton of parallels, again, when we think about terrorism, right? I mean, the concerns of the West German government in the 1970s that some of these Marxist terrorist groups like the Red Army faction were actually being sponsored by the Soviet government, in the 1970s and 80s, that it might be Soviet arms or indirect Soviet proxies that were supporting the Irish Republican Army, arming and training them in parts of North Africa. For some of the governments in the Mideast, there's been a recurring concern about Iranian-backed terrorism, right? And what it is that the Revolutionary Guards Council has gotten up to in sponsoring and supporting and providing, in some cases, really detailed target intelligence to terrorist organizations across the world. So in those cases, yes, as a defender, as a counter-terrorist, you are playing back against an entity that has some kind of nexus, connection, overt allegiance or just loose affiliation with a state. And we've seen those operations, entail some amount of risk as a result, but they've been going on for a long time. So I think that the way I'd think about it is that we have a model for those kinds of operations already. Part of it too is, as in cyberspace, where we see in some cases similar proxy relationships like that, where a state is involved and is trying to push a non-state group to act on their behalf. That's an important linkage that we also want to disrupt. Right? Because state resources behind an attack that doesn't look like a state gets to be really tricky, right? If it's something that if an adversary is able to sustain an operation against a network, right, that's time consuming, or it's operating against really esoteric infrastructure like a piece of operational technology in the power grid. If they're being backed by a state, that can make that an unsustainable problem for an owner operator, for someone who actually sits on that network. So anyway, to your question, I think, there's definitely a model there that we're trying to match a little closer to that sits in terrorism that also clicks over to cyber.
And to your geopolitical point, I think this also matches back to the dangers of that, catastrophic model of cybersecurity. In the wake of SolarWinds or Sunburst, there were a lot of people saying things like, no, this is an attack. We need to respond this, trying to kind of blow it up a lot or, speak very strongly about it, saying that we need to have a strong response. Whereas in reality, as far as we know, Sunburst was an espionage operation. And if we are using this catastrophic terminology for an espionage operation, even one as, large and intrusive as it was, we are denormalizing behavior that, we engage in. And in the future, when we engage in these types of operations, they would be able to come back and said, well, you said that this was like war. Yeah, that's why we need to have this model that takes reality as reality and doesn't try to turn everything into a catastrophe.
And that, I guess, is a great way to sort of rephrase something from your article that says Washington would be better served by ensuring that the response is pragmatic rather than punitive, which is sort of what you're getting at, I think, with this idea of people demanding a strong response.
Exactly. Yeah, it's not the sexy work of attacking back and, speaking strongly, sending a message, but it's the real work of cybersecurity, which is looking at, how did this happen? How can we determine faster, detect it faster, remediate everything faster, and then prepare better?
And one of those hows that you suggest in terms of working together between the government and private entities, I thought the Hunger Games idea was an interesting one.
We're glad that one gets attention. I think it's, there's nothing like a modern pop reference to try to pull people in. It's, So the Hunger Games, the notion of the breach response Hunger Games is effectively that there is a mechanism for internal competition inside of the federal government for any .gov or, .mil, so intelligence or defense agency, if they want, to participate in what is effectively a test of breach response capabilities, specifically looking at the comprehensiveness of the response, right? How much of the threat can you eliminate, do you detect? And the speed. And part of the reason that we put this together was to say, we recognize that agencies operate very different looking networks. Just like in the real world with the private sector, not only do companies look different based on size and maturity, but even companies in the same industry at the same size look different depending on their own culture and depending on the technology sort of space that they're bought into. So rather than asking any one party to go through all of these .gov agencies and say, okay, go build us a model for the best breach response protocol you can possibly come up with that, somehow is both comprehensive, but also addresses all of these little, peculiarities of individual agencies. Let's work in the opposite direction. Let's leverage the fact that these agencies have existing security teams and have good local information about their networks. And let's let them demonstrate how they respond to breaches and see what works best. Where has there been some interesting local innovation, or where has, for example, a cognizant CISO architected their systems in such a way to make that breach response easier to manage and faster to happen effectively. And so the approach here is to try to surface good ideas and best practices, and in some cases, bad practices, and call them out and reward the good and try to punish the bad as this thing happens several times each year. And over time, to use that as effectively a learning process for the federal government to figure out how to defend these systems more effectively. And I think for us, that's a little bit more of an outside the box recommendation from the report, but it sits exactly in this counterterrorism space of, there is so little that we know about the operating environment. It is so difficult to build an accurate picture of a society and then keep that picture, up to date. So rather than trying to go top down, let's think about bottom up. How do we drive or sort of empower organizations to secure themselves and teach others?
And how do you see the collaboration? Another point that you have in here is collaborating between the government and the fact that, victims in cybersecurity incidents can be private companies and other entities as well. How do you see that sort of collaboration right now, and how do you see that improving?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the way that we're seeing it now is that private actors are victims, obviously, in many cases, but they're also really sort of critical components of the defense, right? It's the platform technology vendors that have, in some ways, unparalleled insight into their systems and the actors that are manipulating them. Mm-hmm. It's insurance providers who are able to look across multiple different classes of target and start to track efficacy of different security controls and preferences and adversary behavior. It's the ISACs and some of these other civil society organizations and nonprofits that are the mechanisms for information sharing amidst an incident or before an incident. So there's a huge role for the private sector to play. And that matches, again, what we see in counterterrorism, where, there's critical relationships between an agency, a security agency, and, say, an airline, to try and understand which passengers are headed and where, from ports of embarkation and the private companies that serve them. Even the targets themselves, right? It's the owner of a large office park that's taking steps to secure that facility or to manage access control to that facility. That is a part of that sort of counterterrorism policy and response. And so that's, I think for us, is another part of this analogy that just rings really true, is we can't really talk about cybersecurity without leading with the private sector in many ways, beyond just owning the infrastructure. They're the players in a lot of these cases. And so state policy, again, is less about an exceptional weapon system that only the state controls, like a nuclear missile, and much more about influencing and shaping and supporting behavior in the private sector, given that they are, the predominant actor in most of these engagements.
And it goes to the perimeter or non-perimeter idea really as well, because if you try and hunker down all of your government sites and networks, you still are vulnerable because maybe a partner that you are a contractor that you're working with is maybe more vulnerable than they should be or something like that.
Massively, yes. And I'll let Emma talk about this in the Sunburst case because we saw that evidence, but it's absolutely right. The transition in thinking between I and the defense environment or I and the government environment need to wall myself off from the internet and protect my own stuff and hope for the best. We have seen the fruits of those policies evidenced in the last 15 years with a scourge of ransomware attacks, recurring cyber espionage targeting vendors and manufacturers of every conceivable size across the United States and its allies. And the results, right, exactly of what you would get of buttoning up in a bunker and saying everybody on the outside is hosed and has to fend for themselves is they have to fend for themselves, and it doesn't go very well. Just like you would expect if you said, okay, we're going to stop worrying about the terrorists that don't target the White House. So I think you're right. But but to Emma, I mean, the Sunburst case provides some really interesting evidence of exactly what we just talked about with the vendor side.
Yeah. So one of the things that we talk about in this piece and the report is that idea of blast radius and identifying the blast radius. And on the flip side, if you are an attacker, you look for those junctures of where your intent meets accessibility. And in this case, you don't have to go just straight to the source, straight to your target. You can look back down those software supply chains that are all messy and interwoven and no one really knows where they go. And you can find a point of accessibility. And maybe that point of accessibility just happens to have some of the top technology companies and a bunch of government entities along its software supply chain. And, that character of cyberspace and of these software supply chains are a great parallel to the tactics that are used in terrorism. You're trying to make the most out of the resources that you have because you're probably going against an opponent that is stronger or better resourced than you are. And so in our responses, we need to be, fully aware of that situation. If it's not just you, we are all in the same boat. We have a shared fate and we share that same landscape. Any action that you take in this space, it's not just going to affect your own standing or the standing of your adversary, but it also affects the environment itself. As was said by, many different guerrilla theorists, you hide in the people and you hide in the terrain. And in cyberspace, the people are both themselves and they're kind of the terrain as well. So it applies very strongly in this space.
And when you talk about the sort of the blast radius idea, one of the main components that you are looking to emphasize is this idea of harm limitation. And I bring this up because you guys use a pretty strong word in this article a couple times, the word brutal, in terms of brutally prioritizing. What is this idea of brutal prioritization?
Yeah, no, it's an offshoot of ruthless from the report, ruthless prioritization of risk. It's to communicate two things. The first is, as we looked at the sort of wreckage, the aftermath of the Sunburst campaign, one of the things that stood out is that there has been a recurring attempt by federal cybersecurity leaders to try and solve all of their problems, which is to say, try to address all of these sources of risk and evaluate and audit and secure all of their software. And the problem with that is that it's antithetical to the notion of risk management, right? Where you are prioritizing some risks over others and you are managing them, but not eliminating them. And so we use the word ruthless partly to catch people's attention, which I think it has, which is good, but also to say that there's going to be winners and losers in policies that seek to secure software. And so when we talk about blast radius in the report, one of the things that we suggest is that for the .gov and separately for the .mil, that there be a single agency charged to assess the blast radius, the potential harm or scope of harm of all software and technology used on those networks. That is a massive amount of technology. It's a massive number of different pieces of software and hardware. And so to prioritize those which are most harmful, even just the top 50 or top 100, that the effort taken to secure those will have significant benefits to the whole of the .gov or the whole of the .mil. And against that small number of the highest impact or highest consequence devices, this agency and we propose federal government should be applying the most rigorous methodologies to assess the security, the integrity, the authenticity of that code. That necessarily means we're not going to take the very best tool in our arsenal, everything but the kitchen sink, and throw it against all software used on federal networks. And so the other side of ruthless is some things will be left out of the boat. They won't be ignored, right? We're not looking to say, that the folks should be installing random pieces of software on federal government computers and just, YOLOing their way through cybersecurity. But it does say that we're only going to be able to apply the most intensive efforts to a small number of products and services, those which we think are going to harm us most. Pretending otherwise puts us in a really ugly space, to some extent, the status quo. And so ruthless is a way to communicate that we're not going to take every technique and every defensive measure and apply it to every product. And hopefully that way we actually are acknowledging a reality and making ourselves more secure.
So we would definitely encourage folks to read this whole piece, and we'll have a link in the description to it. But you mentioned that this is sort of an appetizer to an overarching project. Can you tell us a little bit about the overall project?
Yeah, I think that, for our purposes, the goal is to try and provide some alternative thinking to the way that we've talked about cyber conflict and strategy over the last several years. And so we're exploring counterterrorism and counterterrorism scholarship and policy as one avenue of work. We're also looking at counterinsurgency theory to see are there experiences. Again, there's some real serious parallels in the amount of intelligence that's at play and conflict below the level of war and lots of non-state actors. But looking at that theory and some of the lived experience of the last 15 years in particular, see where we can try to harvest lessons that might inform the way we think about and operate in cybersecurity more effectively. So hopefully, stay tuned for more over the next year. Obviously, there's going to be, I think there's a lot of ground to cover, but there's going to be plenty of cybersecurity happenings that take place in that time. So hopefully we'll have a lot to talk about.
Sure, there will be plenty of happenings. So where should people go if they want to learn more?
Atlantic Council, the Cyber Statecraft Initiative website. If ever you are unsure of where to find us, atlanticcouncil.org/breakingtrust will take you to this work that we're doing on the software supply chain. From there, you can explore any of our other projects and products as you see fit. Please get in touch with us there or on Twitter @CyberStatecraft if you want to learn more.
Great. Trey, Emma, thank you very much for joining us. Very interesting subject matter today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us.
Thank you much.
And in lieu of our normal headline segment, Lance Whitney, as we said, is going to help us cover a few different news stories in the cybersecurity world this week. So let's get to Lance Whitney. Today we welcome technology writer and former IT pro Lance Whitney to discuss some of the latest news in the cyber world, including the status of the dark side group following the Colonial Pipeline attack, a new ransomware warning for healthcare providers, and another cyber threat affecting consumers. Lance, thanks very much for joining us.
Sure. Thanks, Kevin. Good to be here.
Let's start with DarkSide and the Colonial Pipeline attack. A lot has happened since we first learned of the attack. So do you think DarkSide, the folks involved in that, kind of wish it hadn't happened, or where do they stand, really?
Yeah, that's definitely the impression. I think they bit off more than they could chew. It seems like they have been getting their wrists slapped after this attack. The boldness, if you will, of going after something that's considered critical infrastructure, and then the repercussions that the attack had, the aftermath. Fortunately, Colonial Pipeline was able to get its operations back online before too long. But even in the short period of time where they had to take the pipeline down, you saw that there definitely were some side effects that contributed to higher gas prices and some longer lines for a short period of time. If this attack had been greater and if it had taken longer for the company to get things back online again, then it definitely could have had severe repercussions in terms of gas prices and shortages. So I think the dark side people definitely underestimated the impact that this type of attack would have. And I do think in some ways they are regretting it, because it had a couple of impact in a couple of ways. I think it was the final straw that broke the back as far as the U.S. government finally realizing we need to do something about this. And I think it also put alarm bells among other ransomware groups as far as what they could safely get away with.
Right. And as I understand it, this attack was the result of a ransomware as a service type model. Could you tell us what that model looks like and sort of where DarkSide sits in it?
Sure, yeah. So the interesting thing about these ransomware groups is they really do operate like legitimate businesses. Ransomware as a service means that you have a large organization or a small organization in some cases that parcels out different aspects of the ransomware campaign. So in this case, the DarkSide people have a ransomware product that is used to infiltrate networks and encrypt files and do the usual ransomware items. And what they do is they parcel out different aspects of the campaign to what they call affiliates. So you might have an affiliate who would do the initial attack or gain the initial access into the network. You might have an affiliate who does some things after the fact, after the ransomware attack has been pulled off. So it's all a matter of this one group, this loose-knit group of cyber criminals doling out different phases of the overall campaign. And then obviously each affiliate gets a certain cut of the action.
And so in this case, when we're talking about the choice of target, this is an affiliate who would have actually, picked out Colonial in this particular case.
Yes, that's exactly it. And that was one of the interesting repercussions of this attack, because I think traditionally these ransomware as a service gangs have lost a little bit of control, if you will, over the overall process. And they've been giving a certain amount of carte blanche to these affiliates to carry out attacks as far as choosing the victim, choosing how and when the attack is carried out. And I think they realized that that's not such a great idea. And so whatever affiliate this was that carried out the attack obviously made a major boo-boo there in targeting the wrong type of organization. And you saw afterwards that the Revil ransomware group, which is kind of considered the biggest one out there, pulled back and made it clear to the affiliates that, okay, from now on, you need to check with us before you pick a potential victim, because we don't want you making the same mistake again. And then secondly, they said certain victims are not allowed. It's government services, healthcare providers, different companies that are organizations that are considered vital to a nation's infrastructure, for example, would not be allowed anymore. So the ransomware community is definitely trying to exercise a much tighter rein on what these affiliates are allowed to do.
Right. And that's definitely something that is not unfamiliar to us. We hear a lot of these ransomware and other attacker groups tend to have a code of ethics, so to speak, about not targeting certain types of entities. Is this just kind of the first time we're seeing that in real practice, where they've actually had to crack down and go beyond just a manifesto on a website somewhere?
We've had this before, certainly over the past year with the coronavirus pandemic. That kind of had a mixed response from the cyber criminal community out there, is that as healthcare providers were struggling to treat the virus, and as scientists and healthcare research facilities were struggling to come up with a vaccine, there were some ransomware groups who promised that they would not attack organizations that were involved in the COVID-19 effort. I think I always have the impression that they did that more for PR reasons than anything else, to kind of make themselves look a little bit more noble in the overall scheme of things, because if anything, you had even more attacks against hospitals and certain healthcare providers last year, because some of these groups realized that medical personnel were obviously under much greater stress and strain, and so these organizations would not be as capable or as prepared in fighting a cyber attack, and then they would be much easier pickings for ransomware.
And we'll get back to that issue a little bit more in a moment. But getting back to DarkSide in particular, so now that we're a few weeks out from the attack and a lot of public aftermath of it, what is DarkSide's status right now?
They're definitely under the radar at this point. They did come out with some statements recently saying that they had lost access to some of their resources, to their website and their blog posts and their means of operation. I think they're certainly trying to give the impression that they are no longer in business. Certainly what tends to happen is when a cyber criminal group gets a little bit too much publicity or attracts a little bit too much in terms of law enforcement, they will go undercover. They'll hide under a rock for a while until the publicity passes and we move on to other things. But then they have a tendency to resurface. Either the members of the group will join other groups, or some of them will resurface under a different name and maybe slightly different tactics. So I don't think we may have heard the last of DarkSide the way it's defined in terms of the attacks they've carried out, but I certainly don't think we've heard the last of the members of this loose-knit group, because ransomware is a very profitable business. And, even though they bit off more than they could chew in this specific case, it's not as if they've learned their lesson and now they're gonna lead a life of sainthood.
So this is not a coming to Jesus moment so much as just laying low until the heat's off.
No, unfortunately not. It would be very nice if we could think of these kinds of people that way and human nature that way, but unfortunately, I think they've tasted the profitability of this type of life of crime, and they're not gonna give that up easily.
Well, and we're talking about all the negative implications of this attack, but they did still come away with $4.4 million from the ransom itself. So they have something to show for it, a parting gift, if you will.
Yeah, exactly. Sure. That's the whole point of it. That's certainly nothing to sneeze at. And that's why ransomware is such a popular and prevalent business among these cybercrime groups, is because, it's millions and millions of dollars as far as a windfall that they get for, I don't want to say little effort, but they're definitely getting a lot of bang for the buck. When you think of how a ransomware attack is carried out, especially if you're using affiliates to help you with the overall process, the time and effort and energy involved really pays off with a huge win, a huge financial win in the long run. So even if you're caught, or even if you have to go undercover for a while, you could definitely enjoy your spoils for quite some time.
So speaking more on ransomware and getting back to the healthcare organizations that we touched on a bit earlier, you have another article sort of warning the healthcare organizations that in the last year, targeting has gone quite up specifically for this Conti ransomware strain. This is not a new ransomware strain, so why is it sort of surging now?
Yeah, I think, again, this kind of goes back to what I was talking about before. So what happens is the FBI came out with an alert recently where they talked about 16 different Conti ransomware attacks that they had discovered against healthcare and first responder organizations. And they specifically talked about attacks against law enforcement agencies, against emergency services, 911 centers, that sort of thing. And again, I think this is just another group that has been taking advantage of the coronavirus outbreak. And they realize that healthcare facilities, hospitals, law enforcement agencies have been really under the gun, have been stressed and strained over the past year dealing with the pandemic. And so they may not be as cognizant of potential attacks out there, and they may not be as well protected as they should be against these types of attacks. So I think definitely the past year has been a much more vulnerable period for these types of organizations, as certainly as far as ransomware goes.
And when we talk about Conti, what does this particular type of ransomware do uniquely?
Sure. So, I mean, from a general point of view, it works just like any other ransomware. They find some kind of vulnerability to get access to a network. And typically that there are a few different ways that might occur. One common way might be through a phishing attack, where you get an employee at an organization to click on a malicious file attachment or click on a malicious link, and the phishing attempt somehow convinces them to sign into what they think is a legitimate account. And by doing so, the cyber criminal is able to get the employee's account credentials, and then from there they use that to sign into the network remotely, and then it's kind of a free-for-all. Certainly another way that ransomware attacks will occur is through some kind of software or product vulnerability. So whatever method they use, they're able to get access to the network. They use their ransomware to encrypt critical files that they find on a server, and then from there threaten the victim with some kind of payment involved. As far as Conti specifically, what the FBI talked about was that, going back to what I mentioned, is they will try to gain network credentials through phishing emails with malicious links or malicious file attachments. In some cases, they will gain access and steal remote desktop protocol credentials. And this is certainly another common vulnerability, especially over the past year, as we've had more organizations turning to a remote workforce because of the pandemic. A lot of organizations had to quickly ramp up a transition to remote working, and because of that, security wasn't always as tight as it should have been from the get-go. So what the Conti group does, like many others do, is they will look for weak credentials for remote desktop access or administrator access, and that gives them a perfect entryway into a network. The FBI also talked about how they're able to gain access to a network through certain ports that may be open and may not be as tightly controlled as they should be. Another thing that they do that's interesting is that, and this is true of other ransomware groups, is when they gain access into a network, they'll take advantage of built-in controls and commands built into the operating system to fish around and check out accounts and check out the network. Other times they'll use legitimate software programs, like the FBI talked about Conti using Microsoft's sysinternals, which is a collection of Windows utilities that give you information and access kind of as to what's going on behind the scenes. So they're pretty savvy as far as what tools they're able to use. And then from there, it's a matter of hunting through the network. And this is where ransomware groups show a fair amount of patience, because this is a process that can go on for days or weeks or even months in some cases, where they're kind of getting the lay of the land. They're checking out the network. They're looking for vulnerable spots. They're looking for critical files and information. And then once they feel they have all the necessary parts in place, then they strike, they encrypt the files, and then contact the victim with a ransom note and give them some deadline and say, unless you pay, we're going to hang on to your files, or we're going to release them publicly to embarrass you.
Right. So in terms of protecting yourselves from this particular ransomware, really just, overall good cyber hygiene and email security should do you pretty well.
Yeah. It's, as I write each of these stories, I tend to hear the same information and advice over and over again. And it's discouraging, because it's discouraging for a number of reasons. First off, a lot of organizations, despite the message being sent out there in so many ways and from so many fronts, a lot of organizations still don't put the focus on security that they should. And it's definitely a challenge. I'm the first to admit that, because there are so many different areas and so many different endpoints and so many different methods that an attacker can use to get access to a network. It is a lot for security professionals to have to deal with. But I think in many cases, it's a kind of a top-down approach. The organization from the top down needs to put more of a focus and more of an emphasis on security. And that should kind of trickle down through the entire company, down to the security people and the IT professionals, as far as the do's and don'ts of protecting themselves. So it's, in some ways, it's not so much the specific tips and tricks on what to do to protect your organization. It's more an overall philosophy and way of working that I think organizations need to focus on to make security the priority that it should be.
And finally, before we let you go, one other piece we wanted to touch on. You did a piece on something called vishing, which was a term I hadn't heard before. So what is vishing, and how does it involve Amazon orders being used for it?
Sure. So we have if you think of the traditional phishing attack, this is typically an email that will be sent to employees in a company, and it will either have a malicious hyperlink or a malicious file attachment. And in either case, responding to that will take the recipient to a phony website that asks them to log in with such and such an account, whether it's their company account or it's a Microsoft account or a Google account or something like that. And that's obviously a way for the attacker to gain their credentials. The way a phishing attack works, and phishing stands for voice phishing, is that the criminal will use phone calls to try to elicit login credentials or other sensitive information from the intended victim. And the way it typically works is, in some cases, they will call the victim directly. In most cases, though, they'll send an email to the recipient with a link asking them to call a certain number. And the initial email will talk about some type of problem or some type of question. It might be referencing an order that the recipient supposedly made. And in this recent one with Amazon, these phishing emails were talking about an invoice or an order that the person reportedly made in which money was due. And the idea is that, well, the person's going to receive this email and say, well, wait a minute, I don't think I ordered anything from Amazon. There must be a mistake here. I better call this number to find out what's going on. When they call the number, they get connected to the cyber criminal, who then impersonates someone from Amazon and says, okay, there may be a mistake here. Give me your Amazon account credentials, your username and password, and let me investigate this and let you know what happens. And of course, that's another way for these people to gain account credentials.
So what should consumers be looking out for when it comes to staying safe from phishing attacks?
Yeah, it's similar. Since many of these start with an initial email, it's somewhat of the same advice that you have with any type of phishing attack. You want to scrutinize the email closely. These types of attacks have gotten savvier over time. In the past, they were pretty easy to spot because they would be loaded with typos and errors and bad links and things like that. But they've gotten a little bit more sophisticated over time. Still, there's usually some kind of clue in the email that you can look for, whether it's the sender's address or the subject line. In some cases, these emails will not have the requisite information as far as terms and conditions and things like that. So you want to look for certain clues in the message. As far as an email or a phone call, you want to beware of anyone who asks you for personal or confidential account information. When you call up a company like Amazon or Microsoft or whoever it might be to deal with some kind of issue, whether it's a sale or an invoice or a technical problem, they are never going to ask you for your password. Anytime you do get questioned about that kind of information, to provide your account details, to provide your password, to provide anything that is confidential, then that's always a tip-off that this is not legitimate. If you do have any doubts about it, the best thing to do is to hang up on the call or don't return the email, and instead contact the company directly. And don't do that through the call. Don't do that through the email. Go to the company's website, look for some kind of contact information or contact phone number or email address, contact the company directly, explain what happened, and that will give you a clue as to whether or not this initial form of contact was legitimate or was some type of scam.
All right, Lance, thanks very much for joining us today. Where can people find more from you?
Sure. So I write a lot for Tech Republic. So if you go to the techrepublic.com website, you'll typically find one of my stories there every day or two. And lately, it seems I've been doing a lot about security. So you'll definitely find several security stories each week about new attacks, new campaigns, and hopefully as well as tips and tricks and ways that you can protect yourself and protect your organization. It does seem kind of dire and depressing sometimes when you look at all the attacks out there, but there are definitely ways to protect yourself and protect your business from these things. So hopefully the stories I do can provide some type of help as far as that goes.
Great. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Ping, a Firewalls.com podcast. And thanks very much to our guests, Emma Schroeder, Trey Herr, and Lance Whitney for joining us. Check out the links in the description for more information about everything we discussed and to find their work. Subscribe or follow now however you listen to ensure you get our latest episodes as soon as they're available, and please do rate and review us. Visit Firewalls.com for all your network security needs and give us a follow on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. For Andrew Harmon, I'm Kevin Baxter. We'll be back soon with another episode, but in the meantime, we remind you to
Get secure, stay secure.